Hey everybody, welcome to DejaVue.
Your favorite Vue podcast. You just don't know it yet. I am Michael Thiessen, a full-time Vue educator and instructor, and I'm here with Alex.
Hey everyone, yes, Alexander Lichter here, web engineering consultant and Nuxt.js team member, as well as YouTube and Twitch content creator, all around Vue and Nuxt, also a bit of JavaScript and TypeScript and stuff. And today we bring you some awesome Nuxt tips straight away for you in a digestible way that you might not know already, because there is so much around the framework. Like it's tough to have the overview about everything. Even if you read the docs nowadays, maybe in a week or two, there are some new features added. So yeah, we have some hidden gems, so to say.
Yeah, I have been, for the last month or two now, been working on a book called Nuxt Tips Collection, taking my knowledge of Nuxt and also scouring the docs, diving into the source code a little bit, and trying to find like those interesting things that are useful and maybe a little obscure. Maybe you didn't know that they were there. And I've packaged it into an ebook, and it will be launching on August 5th. So if you're listening to this podcast right when it comes out, that's next Monday. But you can get a $10 off this book with the DejaVue code. So that's more than 10% if you are, listening to this and you want to grab that book. We'll leave that teaser there. Let's get on to some tips.
Yeah, let's do a little sneak peek, because all these tips, as Michael said, will be part of Michael's book. So you get some free content here straight away for you. What a steal, huh?
So this first tip is one that I think many of you will enjoy. It's all about being able to disable the auto imports in your Nuxt app. So a lot of people love this feature. You don't have to import things. It just magically works. But many of you find it frustrating. And now we can disable these with the imports.scan configuration. And you set that to false, and it will stop Nuxt from importing your composables and your utils.
Exactly. And I mean, before we had like an auto imports false flag already under the imports key in your Nuxt config, but it only stopped from like actually importing packages and like imports from like Vue, for example, but not your own local folders. So luckily that got improved. And well, maybe for the people who really don't like that, yeah, you can disable it. It's not a problem, because that's the whole idea of Nuxt. No vendor lock-in. And if you don't like these auto imports, if they're too magical for you, then feel free to disable them. And there's also a very nice plugin for ESLint. It's actually a Nuxt module that will hook into the Nuxt ESLint module from Anthony Fu, also linked all the way down in the show notes, which actually will explicitly add these imports instead of using auto imports to your code base. So check that out. And if something doesn't work, give feedback on the repository, but it's pretty smooth.
Yeah, and it's important to note that this will not disable the auto imports for your components directory, because that lives in a different config option. There's the components property that you can configure, where you can specify how different directories are going to load components, whether you want to load them all as global components or have them auto imported, all that kind of stuff. So if you want to also disable auto imports for your components, you got to go to that configuration property instead.
Exactly. And maybe while we're talking about auto imports, I wonder, what's your take on them? Like, I also have some opinions, but I'm really curious, Michael, what do you think about auto imports? Do you think they're too magical? Do you like them? Would you like leave them on? Or as soon as that option came out, like, yeah, false, disable?
So I actually really like them for the most part. And I think they're great for smaller projects for sure, because you don't want to deal with all this boilerplate and overhead, and you can just get started, and there's not a lot of downsides in doing that. But I think as the project grows, then there's more likelihood that you're going to have, several different overlay drop down sidebar components, or whatever. That's not a real component. But like, you're going to have, oh, this component is going to be used in this part of the app, this component can be used in this part of the app, and you are more likely to run into naming collisions that way. And it can be tricky, because sometimes the clearest name for something is just like a header component that you want to use in a place. But then you've got 7 different header components, and which one will show up when you do the auto imports, it's unclear. And so I think in some ways having the manual imports makes it a lot more explicit and yeah, solve that problem.
Interesting. Yeah. Like, so I'm a big proponent of auto imports, mainly because I think if you see like a ref or a compute it in your code, then if you use Vue for a bit longer than a couple of hours, you probably know it's from Vue. And then, of course, with the obscurities, like I sometimes agree. If I go into like a new project and then it's like, okay, is this a composable from Vue use or not a library or not a library? Also about Vue use, we also did a podcast episode on that, so definitely check it out. Link also in the show notes. Then it might be a bit tricky, like to find the origin. Then usually people search for it or they click on it, then they land, and that's a bit of a pity, like the TypeScript file for that, because the components, like, and also the composables and utils, they all like have basically global TS files that are in your .nuxt folder, because that's how you make sure TypeScript still works. Luckily, there's also a VS Code extension that will then straight away bring you to the source file, which is what you usually want. And then you're there. But yeah, sometimes it can be a bit obscure. With the component naming, though, I think this is mainly solved by something called path prefix. So if you have like multiple headers, then, I mean, maybe it would start even a bit earlier. If you say you have an app header and you have several variants, then you probably should name them if you can't really like set them apart by props. And then you can also go with like, okay, maybe there's an app header or a user's header or I don't know, a sidebar header or whatnot. And then you can say, let's create folders in the components folder. And then you say have components, app, header, and then you auto import app header instead of just header. So in that way, it can be a bit more clear and also correspond very well with your project structure.
Yeah, if you're more disciplined with naming, yeah, then that's not really an issue, the naming collision thing. So I'd agree with you there. I think for myself, I'm just maybe a little too lazy with naming, and that's my own problem.
The naming things is
back to bite
hard.
me.
Like it's difficult. Don't get me wrong. Like I always, I'm on stream, be like, okay, what do I name that? Like I did stream and name things like a to do module, because like just modules, it's so broad. But I didn't have a good term, so I just first go with to do, and it's still in the code because well, still didn't find a good name for it. So I totally understand that, and in a way, I also value explicitness in code. It's just as long as I can find the source pretty quickly, which I can by clicking on it with that little VS Code extension, I personally am good. But luckily, that's the beauty of it. You can choose for your own project, for your company's projects, what to do. And as you said, Michael, lots of people, they were really, really looking forward to that feature to disable these things. Also in Nitro as well, not only on the Nuxt side. And yeah, that happened.
Our next tip is a file that you maybe didn't know Nuxt could use, and that's the .nuxtignore file. So this works exactly like a .getignore file, except it will cause Nuxt to ignore some files when it's building your app. So if you have some Vue files in there or other things that you don't actually want Nuxt to import for whatever reason, or not import, but use in the build, then you can put your glob pattern in there for the files or the directories or whatever it is that you want and configure it that way.
Yeah, I think also something that's pretty underused. Mainly, usually when I try to ignore certain files, I just put a dash in front because that's the ignore prefix that's set in Nuxt. And you can also configure it if you want to, like almost anything else. So if you have like a script that shouldn't go all the way bundled in your application, but maybe it's in a utils folder, then yeah, putting a dash in front will just ignore it for Nuxt, and you're good. But I also think if the prefix is not enough, or if you need certain names to be accurate, or want like a good overview of what is ignored in general, not just like have a dash here, a dash there, then the nuxtignore is also a good option.
Yeah, and a lot of the things in Nuxt and the way that they're loaded in can be configured based on directory and names. So like the components that we mentioned in the previous tip, you can configure those how you want. And so in a lot of ways, we don't even need this .nuxtignore file, but it is there if you need it.
Exactly. And especially if you are familiar with .gitignore, docker ignore, all these ignore files, then it's pretty easy to like just say, okay, I can do literally the same thing just for Nuxt and I'm good. So yeah, why not?
So tip number 3 is on deduping fetches. And so in Nuxt, we've got a bunch of different data fetching composables. We've got use fetch, we've got use async data, and then there's like some lazy versions of that as well. And we can actually dedupe fetch requests now. So with use fetch, with use async data, if the arguments that you pass in are reactive and they update, then a new fetch will happen. And that's one of the beauties of these composables is that they are reactive. However, if they are sending lots of requests, how do you handle that? If you've got a request already outgoing and you're waiting for it, do you create a new request or do you wait for that existing one to come back and resolve? So that's what this dedupe parameter lets us do. If we set it to defer, then we will defer to the original request and wait for that to come back, and we won't send a new one. But we can also set it to cancel. So we can cancel that original request in favor of this new one and get the more recent, latest data instead.
Exactly. I think it's also something people should utilize more. Like deduping requests, especially if you send lots of requests, might be really good to just not let them run forever, or like, hey, there's a new request. Okay, let's stop it. And it's a nice way to finally like granularly set up the behavior that you want, and you pass that basically to the options in use fetch or use async data. So for use fetch, that's the second argument where you have all your options in. You even pass a custom fetch instance, headers, and so on, so on. And for use async data, it is the third argument because you should set a key first. We'll come to that in a bit too. Then your like async fetching function or whatever you want to do there, ideally without side effects, and then we have some options.
All right. So this next tip is about custom keyed composables. So we know that there are some composables in Nuxt that will have this auto-generated key that's put in. So use async data, as Alex just mentioned, gets this key, but use state also has this key and a bunch of other composables that Nuxt comes with. And this key is there so that we can make sure that these calls are going to be unique. So for example, with use state, we want to make sure that we only have that one version, that we're referencing the right version of the state. So we can basically like naming the state that we are actually using. But if you don't provide that key yourself, then Nuxt will actually figure out its own key based on where in your code you're using that method. So if you've got it on one line, it'll use one key. But if you have it a few lines down, it'll use a different key. So that makes sure that it's going to be a consistent key every time you use it. And this is important because then when we go from the server side and then hydrate back onto the client side, then that will maintain, like we'll be able to sync the data across from client to server.
Correct. And commonly, like in almost all cases, you want to provide an own key. The only exception commonly is use fetch, because in use fetch, the key is just generated by the URL path and the params, and you're good, mostly. You can also set a custom key there if you want to. But for use async data, for example, also use state, I probably wouldn't rely on the Nuxt generated key because it does it with best effort. But let's say, like, it's all global state, right? So let's say you use state in a component, but you want, let's say, an image there, but you want to do it per component. Then if you just give a static key or no key at all, it will be the same key for each of the components because it's only depending on the line and the file. So we like on my component.vue line 15. No matter which instance it is, it will always be the same key. And magically, you share state across components that you probably don't want. So the best solution there is, well, pass in a key, for example, through a property, or, well, if you actually want global state, then that might be okay. I still would probably extract into a composable to make sure, hey, this is intended in a way. Or like, yeah, use a static key that is definitely like unique and you only use the component once. That's also fine if it's just like a tiny abstraction around it. But the generated key can be nice for the start, especially if you say like, okay, I use it in app.vue. it's probably fine. But in everything that you use more than once, I would really recommend setting that key on your own.
Yeah, I agree. It's better to be explicit with these things. But the interesting thing with this is that you can get Nuxt to auto inject that key into your own composables if you wish. And so it will look at the number of arguments that you've passed in when you're using it, and it will, if you've used less, then it knows that you haven't provided that key yourself. And so it'll know, okay, I've got to inject that key for you. And so there's a list of these composables in the Nuxt config, and you can add your own composables to that list and then, get that key in the same way. But again, it's probably better to just make that explicit and pass in your own key instead.
I've never seen that functionality like used in a real world application. Like I haven't seen all the Nuxt apps, obviously, but if one of you out there uses that functionality, I would be super curious to hear what you're doing with it and why. Like, it would be very interesting. And also for the key generation, as Michael mentioned, like it will be auto-generated by the line and how often the method is basically in that file, like that use state, use fetch, use whatever. And it's done through an unplugin. So yeah, that's pretty cool. And yeah, it's pretty smooth to see how it's happening under the hood. But yeah, once again, can never say it often enough. Set an own custom key.
I imagine this is probably more useful if you're authoring a library or something else like that, and you want to make the default out of the box experience a little bit better and not require as many parameters to be passed into your method. You can say, well, you don't have to pass this in, but you should. And then, like you were saying before, just pass in that key for the most part.
And then we come to one more tip, which is probably a bunch, like a big group of things. And it's about layers. Michael, tell us more.
So there are a lot of interesting things with layers. And Alex, you've recorded a great video on these, and I highly encourage everyone to check that out. Also, Dave Stewart has this massive in-depth article on that and gives you some ideas and tips on how to like migrate from non-layers to layers in different ways. And one of the more interesting things about layers for me is that you can actually have different configs per layer. So if you want your components to be imported differently in different layers, you can do that. If you want to take a giant runtime config with, dozens and dozens of different variables that you're defining, well, you can split that up into just the things that layer needs. And Nuxt will do this big deep merge on it. And then, at the end of the day, it works the same. But when you're trying to find, okay, where is this thing defined? Well, the URL for your blog or some other settings for the blog, well, they're defined in the blog layer. And so you can just go straight there and you know where to find it.
Yeah, and I mean, same for like components, pages, and so on. So you have a really good opportunity to slice your application by scope, by feature, however you want to call it, like to have even some domain-driven design going on just by using layers. And then you never worry like, okay, I have components folder with thousands of components. Where do I find things and how do they belong together in a way, like how they're coupled? With layers, you basically have a very nice encapsulation by that feature. And you can even define like a base layer if you want to that all of them use eventually, if that's needed. And with Nuxt4, you even have a layers folder straight away at your fingertips in your own application directly, like it works with modules nowadays. If you want to define local modules, same way it works with layers. You have a /layers, also shown it in the Nuxt4 folder structures video, and then you can just put in all the layers that you want there, which is great for slicing per feature. But if you have like more complex layer setups, like layers needing layers, that might not be the best approach. Still, it's very useful for a vast majority of cases.
One thing I didn't mention about Nuxt Tips collection earlier is that I'm also including different code demos. So like with commented code that you can go in and interact with the different things and play around with the code to see how things work. And one of the demos is on layers. And yeah, in there you can see different things about how the for example, like importing components and other things between different layers and how the naming collisions might resolve themselves. There's some interesting things there that are good to keep in mind. But what's also interesting is that you can import child pages between layers. So if your root or like your main app has a page with a Nuxt page on there, Nuxt page component that will render out child pages, well, each of your layers can contribute child pages as long as they're, named the same way that you would normally name them. It doesn't matter if they're in a different layer or not. And so there's a demo in there about how that works. And it's pretty neat to see how it kind of just like, just works nicely. And it's not too hard to think about in a lot of ways. And I think the layers implementation is a pretty nice way of splitting things up.
I still think there can be some improvements to layers even more, but there are
Mm-hmm.
some technical hurdles, like TypeScript support, for example, is a big one. But all in all, like it's really worth giving it a try. There are some caveats to check, like not using the add until anymore because they only refer to the right path at runtime and not to the path in the layer, and a few more things. But I mean, other than that, it's pretty smooth. And when you use the layers folder, that might not even be a problem. But I would double check on that.
Yeah, we'll have more on Nuxt 4 in the future. So yeah, stick around for that in future episode. I'm sure there will be
Exactly.
one when it comes.
One day when Nuxt will be released. And while we are at layers, maybe there's also a good idea to talk about something that's very often used in like together with layers, but that people might not know about straight away, which is something called app.config.
Yeah, so there are two ways to configure your app. One is runtime config, the other is app config. And they are different, which is why they have different names. But it is confusing to know the differences between the two. And I often find myself referring back to the docs. And I even wrote an article for Mastering Nuxt on the differences. And I keep referring back to that article because it's one of those funny things where, you know, even if you write something about it, a year later, you're like Googling and then you end up on your own article trying to remember, oh, right. I guess I did know this at one point.
Can't remember all the things.
Yeah, and so there's big differences between like build versus runtime. One of the things with app config is that you can use hot module replacement with it. So as you're developing, you can update things. You can actually have good TypeScript support, which is why it's in like its separate file. Runtime config is more for adding in environment variables and things that are going to be configured at runtime. So if you have different authentication URLs for different environments, like your staging and your production, well, often you build the app once, you run it in staging, and then once you've tested it, everything's good, you just kind of like move it over to production. Well, you need to be able to update those environment variables for production now. And so with the app config, those things are already built in at build time and they're stored away. So you can't change them from the environment, basically. So those are some of the differences.
Yeah, I think like what you mentioned with runtime config is very important. Also, like if you don't rebuild your application but just want to change things, like I don't know, deploy to 4 different Docker containers, and these two should have a different load balancer, or that should be a different API, and you don't want
Right.
to rebuild it for each of them, then it's very essential to actually use runtime config for the end variables, which is one of the most common mistakes people do. With app config, it's also important to mention these are all determined at build time. Like you basically set the values. They're like not like inferred for end variables or similar. But runtime config, for example, has to be serializable. Like you can't use functions, you can't use classes, whatnot. While in app config, you can use more things than just JavaScript primitives. So you can use all these things because it's JavaScript. The file will be bundled, so don't put any secrets in there, and it can be used. And with layers together is pretty nice because also for the app config, you have some kind of merging strategy. You can even define custom mergers for the property you set up. So let's say you have an array and say, okay, the other array should replace that one or merge or like dedupe and put together whatnot. You basically sky's the limit. And this also, once again, made possible by various un.js packages under the hood. So the idea there is it might be a bit confusing that like app.config and runtime config and the nuxt config, they like all exist in a way. But each of them has their purpose, because also, once again, in the nuxt config, everything has to be serializable. So you can't set up, as I said, like classes, functions, nothing else besides that. So that's what app config is there for. But it's important to know that this will all add to your bundle eventually, and it will also be loaded with Nuxt together. So there's no like way to defer that, saying like, oh yeah, app config, I don't need it right now. Good part is also both are reactive, and so you can do whatever you want with them and configure things.
Yeah, and I should note, just to throw this in there, that the app config is not a place to put secrets because it is bundled, and the runtime config can have your secrets on there. So that's another thing to keep in mind. I think what confuses me about them is that the one has a file, app.config has its own separate file, whereas runtime config doesn't have a separate file, and it's like part of the nuxt config file, and it seems like not consistent in that way. And I don't know if it really makes that much of a difference, but it's one thing that sort of trips me up sometimes.
Yeah, the point is, file is an extra file, because that's the easiest way to actually bundle. Then just say like, okay, take the whole file, put it in the bundle, you're good. While like in Nuxt 2, the runtime config was a weird mix of both worlds. Like some parts could be somehow taken over, but not really. And like we want a clear separation between that's the build time config. Like it happens before Nuxt is like being spawned. You need all this information to actually get Nuxt up and running. That's also why you, for example, can't use aliases like the tilde or add in your Nuxt config. And then you have that app config, which is basically just a big export default with all the values that you want in there that will be just used for your actual running application. And then you can set things like, for example, for theming, for settings, layers can toggle certain settings for you. So one case I know for a client of mine is like, okay, we have all these tiny layers modules. And the idea is that eventually customer A wants like these 3 out of the 5 modules. Customer B wants all, and customer C only like 2 of them, but different ones than customer A. So you could say, okay, I built that application and just use these layers, plug them together. They just work out of the box. That's fine. And in your application, you know already which layers are enabled, because each layer just contributes something to the app config saying, hey, I'm on, here are my settings, and I'm on, and the rest might not be.
Yeah, that's an interesting use case for that, is making your app aware of the different layers that exist.
Yep. And you can also use it for feature flags, even if you want to say like, okay, we toggle certain feature flags. I mean, it's a big thing nowadays. Just like, okay, that should go on, that should go off. You could probably also do it through runtime config. Like that would work in a similar way. If you need to have it at runtime feature flag wise, then that might be a better solution. But if you need them at build time, app config might be a way to go there.
So this last tip is less technical, and it's about the different modules that we've got in Nuxt, or in the Nuxt community, I should say. So there's sort of 3 main categories of modules. There are the official modules by the Nuxt team, maintained by the Nuxt team. So for example, Nuxt image, Nuxt content. These ones are maintained by the team, and they're part of the ecosystem here. Then the next is community modules, and these are not, they're sort of like curated out of, they're not really approved, or there's not really like a vetting process. I'm not sure what the process is. Maybe Alex can speak more on this, but there's sort of some way of saying, okay, these are useful for the community. Let's move them into a list that's easily searchable. I think this list is also part of Nuxie. When you do like the add modules, it uses that to look up. And then there's these third-party modules where if you want to create a module, you can just create your own module, prefix it with nuxt dash, push it to NPM or wherever you want to push it, and anyone can download it, and away you go. The interesting thing here is the difference between the official modules and these community ones is the official ones are prefixed with the @nuxt, and the community ones are @nuxt.js. So it's a small difference and maybe a little confusing, but when you're looking at these packages, that maybe gives you a little bit more information on where these packages have come from and how they're being maintained.
Yeah, so a few things to add there. Like the official modules, I think is also important to know. Like besides the good like first party support and like quality wise, pretty much up because we maintain them. Then like they also might be auto installed. Like for example, Nuxt image might be auto installed if you use Nuxt content, or like if you use Nuxt image the first time and don't have it installed, it just asks you, hey, using your Nuxt image component, want to install the Nuxt image module. And Nuxt fonts right now not all installed, might be in the future. So just to improve things. Also other modules like Nuxt scripts, for example, which is in public preview right now, they all like as an idea can be an integral part of most applications. Like if you use web fonts, then like Nuxt fonts is the way to go for you. If you use scripts, like third-party scripts tracking and so on, then Nuxt scripts should be something you take a look at. If you use images, Nuxt images. So it kind of makes sense. But if you say like, yeah, you know what, I have a content-heavy site, not many images, or then you don't need it. Like, or if you said like, I don't need web fonts, then that's good. I, for example, rarely use web fonts, but if I do, I use Nuxt fonts there. And that's an important part. The community modules, that's always a tricky one. Like we have that big list on nuxt.com, right? nuxt.com/modules. And on there are basically all the official modules, so @nuxt, and the community modules, so @nuxt.js. And you can list a module by basically sending a PR saying, hey, okay, that's my module. How does it look like? So you can put it basically up there. And in the community modules, you basically have things like Tailwind CSS. So like, okay, the Nuxt team, like we don't plan making Tailwind a core part of the framework, or like we still have a first party integration for that, right? And it works pretty well. So you don't need to do much. You install the Tailwind module and you're done. Same with Pina, for example. So the background of that is that in the end, people like might maintain their own modules. They can put it into the Nuxt modules organization. They get like a nice banner image, and they can also put it, of course, on the side. While you also find if it's like, okay, I want to maintain it on my own, I don't have to put it to the Nuxt modules repository. That's all good. You can still submit it. That's like fine. So don't worry too much about it. There are also submissions that don't have the Nuxt modules tag, but still. So there's a bit of way to go there. The other thing which might be considered, like the naming wasn't always that clear. We did a little bit of a cleanup throughout some time, because I admit the prefixes were confusing. Also back in time with Nuxt 2, we had like @nuxt.js/axios, even though it was used everywhere. It was like @nuxt.js. And I remember Eduardo making that meme where you have like the two buttons and the guy doesn't know which button to push, and was like @nuxt and @nuxt.js. Like, yeah, which prefix is the module? Could also be a fun game, actually. So if someone wants to build it and check NPM for that, it could be a fun project with Nuxt, just saying. So yeah, Nuxt modules in that way, it's really nice. I'm really happy about all the contributors. Like in the list, I have to check how many, but like we have so many like modules in that list that, for example, yeah, Tailwind, ITN, Vue-use, Pina, the DevTools, of course, there's another official one, by the way, that we didn't even mention, but quite some of them for various libraries that make integration easier. And also for the community modules, lots of them are still maintained by parts of the team. Like Daniel maintained quite some modules, I2, Julian, Lucy, and so on. So Harlan as well with all the Nuxt SEO things, right? So just because it's a community module, it's not like worth less or like bad. I think I would always prefer an @nuxt.js module over a third-party one, just because, okay, it's under Nuxt modules org. People have a look in it. There's also the ecosystem CI to mention. So we have a CI in Nuxt to make sure we don't break any modules. And we check also lots of Nuxt modules once. So we make sure things work nice. And otherwise, we send a PR or like, hey, that broke. Let's fix it together. So that's a good one. But I understand sometimes the confusion. I would probably just take a look at the list, or also the DevTools. They use the same list. And with Nuxi add, they just query the API that's behind that. Because as I said, every time you submit a PR to add a module, it will be just a big list, and you can query that and say like, okay, let's install that module and do do things.
Yeah, I think it's great to get that extra background and information on how the modules system works. And yeah, it's a good point you bring up about that it's not that these official ones are like somehow better. It's just that they make more sense to be part of Nuxt as not just part of the community. And that means that they are more like they're more actively maintained. But like as you mentioned, there are some community ones that are actively maintained by people in the Nuxt team. So
Quite some,
it's not
yeah.
and just, even if someone not on the Nuxt team maintains a module, that doesn't mean that that module is bad in any way. And it's not like the community modules are better or more trusted. I think that's also a good thing to point out. Like there are a lot of modules in there and your team is not, reading through each line and making sure there's like it's written well or anything like that. That's an impossible task, but it's there, it's searchable, and you can see what's going on. I'm sure if there were any issues raised with a module and like weird shenanigans going on, it would not be listed on there anymore. But it's always a tricky thing to figure out which versions of things do you install.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's true. That's true. And also to add, I think the core modules are basically, I think they are for more use cases. They're not bound to a library. They're not bound to a certain web fonts. You can use them any kind of application images, same
Right.
with your dev tools. You might use it for anything, scripts and so on. So they're more general purpose, while most other modules like Pina, of course, it's the preferred state management tool in Vue.js. But on the other hand, it's also like if you want to use state instead, which you totally can, or some own composables, it's fine. So it's a choice you make. While I think the at Nuxt modules are more like these are best practices for everything around the ecosystem. So you should use them when you use a web font or an image to make things, well, more performant, more accessible, and so on and so on.
Yeah, it's almost like they're like extensions of Nuxt itself, which is an interesting question of why have a module for something that's installable instead of having it just be part of Nuxt.
That's a good one. That's good that you. That's really good that you bring it up because it's a fair question, and I think the main point is the versioning part because like Nuxt can run without it, like fine. You can use an image tag without using Nuxt image, but Nuxt image gives you lots of benefits in terms of performance, image providers out of the box, and so on and so on. But if there's a bug fix in Nuxt image, you don't have to wait for Nuxt release. If there's a new feature in Nuxt image, you also don't have to wait for Nuxt release. That's independent. Same for fonts, scripts, ESLint, and so on. Plus, if we would have to merge it onto core, I think it would slow down lots of processes. So the idea there is to have a bit of independence in terms of bug fixes, features, versionings, and basically end up with more productive and better results there, while still giving people the choice to, let's say, if you don't use a web font ever, then you don't need the modules, so you're good, and you don't have a lightweight core, right? You don't need the code in the end.
Yeah. Okay. I like that. Makes sense to me.
Convinced. Perfect.
Convinced. Didn't take much convincing.
Yeah, fair. And also, like on that point, to anyone listening, if you ever wondered, like, oh yeah, I have a cool use case for a module that you wrote yourself because there is none or a good alternative, there's a module author's guide, also linked in the description. Of course, also it's in the docs. So if you're interested, publish it. Like, why not? Mark it as, hey, it's work in progress, and then share it with us if you want some feedback. Like, share it on the Discord, for example, of Nuxt, or get some eyes on it if you're interested in that. Because if this code there and written anyway, the step to generalizing is often, at least not always, but often not too tricky. Sometimes it is, but that's depends a bit on the library. So yeah, give it a go. If you have a module anyway, then why not publishing it?
Yeah, publish it, and the first step is usually to get it to work for one use case, and then another use case, and then getting more eyes on it, especially like eyes of other people who might be more familiar with having built modules in the past or whatever. Like that's probably better than you just like trying to perfect it in in your own secret repo hidden away somewhere.
100%. And also it
hard,
helps
though.
other people. Yeah, that's true. That's true.
It's hard to like push and like show off things that don't feel like they're polished and don't feel like they're good. But yeah, it's often the fastest way.
On the other hand, like for example, we live stream like somewhat regularly, at least for me, like sometimes more, sometimes less. And then we also show off things that are not polished because we're building them right now.
Yeah.
And of course, not everybody is doing live streaming or live coding or content or whatever, but same idea here. Like it's totally fine. Nothing is perfect on the first run and shouldn't be. I mean, that's why you market like, hey, it's work in progress, 0 point something. People can still have a look, can do some suggestions and so on. So don't be afraid, go for it, and nobody will judge you. It's probably opposite. People will be like, hey, cool that you open source it. So
exactly.
no reason not to do it. And there's another thing where there's no reason not to do it, which is coming around to the conference in Bonn, Germany, the Vue.js DE conference. If you want to see amazing speakers like Danny Rowe, a live Q&A remote, but still there live with Avenue. Was also here, by the way, if you have missed it out, 2 amazing episodes with him. And lots of other amazing speakers, lightning talks, which is the conference is in early October, and you get a whopping 10% discount with the lovely code DejaVue. Link for it also in the description. So if you come around, please say hi. I'd love to see you all around, and looking forward to meet some of you.
And before we wrap up, I want to give you the full details on Nuxt Tips collection, since I only gave a little bit of a teaser earlier on. So we've got 117 tips in an ebook. And you don't just get this ebook, you also get emails every workday. So you get 2 tips every day. And I've had a lot of people tell me about the Vue tips collection that I did in the past, that, you know, you're working on one project, you get some tips in your inbox, and then you realize, oh, wait, that thing is helping me with this thing I'm working on right now. And that's pretty crazy. And so that's a really nice feature. And there's the 7 code repos that you'll get as well. So you can play around with some things and dig into some code. And it's launching August 5th, which might be in a few days from now, and it might be today, depending on when you're listening to this. And if
yesterday.
or yesterday, or 3 days ago, or okay, we've covered our bases there. You also can get an extra $10 off using the DejaVue code. So check it out. Link in the show notes, description, wherever you are.
Exactly. And last but not least, we want to know from all of you, besides if you have used the auto-keyed composables ever in Nuxt. If you do, as mentioned, tell us. And we want to know, what is your favorite Nuxt gem or Nuxt tip? What would you say, like, is something you found out, like, oh my god, is this possible? That solves so many headaches. Of course, besides Nuxt itself. So let us know. Let us know what your favorite feature is that you're like, I can't live without this anymore. It can be module, doesn't have to be in the core. Yeah, bring it on. Exactly. Or one of later episodes, definitely check them out. And until then, stay tuned. See you around, folks.